There is a war above your head. It is fought in silence. It is fought in vacuum. And every assumption the last century built about peaceful skies has already been broken. Quietly, deliberately, 300 kilometers above your head. This channel does not cover space news. It opens the black box of orbital conflict, the classified spacecraft, the proximity stalkers, the directed energy weapons, the intelligence operations that most coverage cannot see and most governments will not name. Forensic research, orbital mechanics, open source intelligence. No talking points, no press releases, only what the data proves. Forensic research, orbital mechanics, open source intelligence. No talking points, no press releases, only what the data proves. You are watching Orbital Black Box. Act 1. The Inciting Incident. 6:09:03 UTC. There is a graveyard above your head. It sits 300 kilometers above the most valuable strip of real estate in the solar system, a belt of geostationary orbit 35,786 kilometers above the equator, where 550 active satellites carry your phone calls, your bank transfers, your military's nuclear command, and roughly 12 trillion United States dollars a day in financial transactions. The graveyard is the attic above that belt. We were told the attic was empty. We were told nothing important lives there. We were told it was where dead satellites go to coast in silence forever. On the morning of January 30th, 2026, at 6 minutes and 9.03 seconds past 6 o'clock Coordinated Universal Time, something in that attic exploded. It was a satellite. It was Russian. Its official name was Luch. Its NATO designation was Olymp-K. Its catalog number, assigned by the United States Space Force, was NORAD 40258. For 11 years and 4 months, it had been the most prolific signals intelligence platform ever deployed in geosynchronous orbit. And for those same 11 years and 4 months, it had been hiding in plain sight, parked next to commercial communications satellites belonging to America, France, Italy, Luxembourg, and Norway, listening to their uplinks, mapping their command channels, and quietly absorbing the electromagnetic soul of NATO. 3 months earlier, in October of 2025, the Russians had nudged it up into the graveyard orbit and walked away. They thought the story was over. The first thing the Russians got wrong about the death of Olymp-K is that they thought they got to choose when it died. Think for a moment about what you are looking at when you look at the geostationary belt. It is a ring of human technology, 35,786 kilometers above the equator, where the orbital period of a spacecraft exactly matches the rotation of the Earth. So the satellite appears to hang motionless in the sky over a single longitude. It is the only orbital regime in which you can build a fixed ground antenna and never have to track the satellite by hand, because the satellite is always in the same place. That single physical fact, derived from a 1945 essay by the British engineer Arthur C. Clarke, is the foundation of global broadcast television, transoceanic communications, secure military command, weather monitoring, financial timing infrastructure, and roughly 9/10 of the things you would not notice were gone until you tried to use them. There is no replacement architecture for geostationary orbit. There is no Plan B. And we have just had forensic confirmation that an unmonitored debris field sits in the attic above it, 300 kilometers higher, where untracked kinetic objects are still moving, still capable of striking spacecraft, and still, as of the date this video uploads, completely outside the surveillance perimeter of any government catalog on Earth. This is the story of a ghost. For 11 years it haunted NATO's most secure satellites. Then it died, and its corpse became a weapon. 550 active satellites are still flying below it. They include the spacecraft that route your credit card transactions. They include the spacecraft that route your military's nuclear command. They include the satellites that synchronize the world's power grids, timestamp every trade on every stock exchange, and carry encrypted bandwidth for NATO operational planning over Ukraine, the Baltic, and the Mediterranean. None of them can be moved. None of them have been told the attic above their heads is no longer empty. And the satellite that did the haunting? Its successor is still up there, still listening, right now, as you watch this. Its name is Olymp-K 2, and according to a Financial Times exclusive published on the 4th of February 2026, it has approached at least 17 European satellites since 2023, closing to within 10 kilometers in at least one documented case. The ghost is dead. The mission is not. Welcome to the Orbital Black Box. Act 2. The Ghost's Life. Chapter 1. The Birth at Baikonur. To understand why a dead satellite exploding is more terrifying than a live satellite spying, you have to start at Baikonur. On the evening of September 28, 2014, at exactly 20 hours, 23 minutes Universal Time, when a Proton-M heavy-lift rocket with a Briz-M upper stage lifted a 3,000-kilogram payload off the desert floor of Kazakhstan and into geosynchronous transfer orbit. The Russian space agency Roscosmos issued a press release that same night, describing the satellite as a civilian asset, part of the Luch data relay constellation, a routine telecommunications mission. Every serious open-source intelligence analyst on the planet knew, within 72 hours, that the cover story was a lie. The satellite had not been built by NPO Lavochkin or RKK Energia, the design bureaus that construct Russia's civilian communications fleet. It had been built by JSC Information Satellite Systems Reshetnev, the Russian state design house in the closed city of Zheleznogorsk in Siberia. The same factory that builds GLONASS navigation satellites, Garpun military communications spacecraft, and almost every classified Russian military platform of the past 40 years. It was constructed on an Express 2000 bus, repurposed from cancelled commercial Yamal contracts. Its internal procurement index, 11K166, appeared in tender documents on the Russian government's open procurement portal zakupki.gov.ru, tying the spacecraft directly to the Russian Ministry of Defense and via a 2014 leak in the newspaper Kommersant, all the way to the Federal Security Service, the FSB. Anatoly Zak, the Russian-born aerospace journalist who has been documenting Russian launches for 2 decades through his site Russian Spaceweb, called the cover story a late and rather clumsy attempt to camouflage a military payload within a civilian constellation. He wrote that Roscosmos's decision to share the name Luch with its actual civilian data relay birds seemed to be a misinformation campaign that continued after the launch. The misdirection was so obvious, it was almost insulting. Inside the satellite, behind the unconvincing label of civilian data relay, sat one of the most sophisticated signals intelligence packages Russia had ever launched. European space historian Bart Hendricks, whose 9-year forensic investigation of the Olymp-K program remains the most authoritative open-source assessment ever published in the Space Review, has reconstructed what the satellite actually carried. The propulsion came from the Keldysh Research Center in Moscow, a set of KM60 Hall-effect thrusters producing 930 watts of electrical power and 42 millinewtons of thrust at a specific impulse of 1,860 seconds. The attitude control thrusters were OKB Fakel K50-10.5 catalytic units. The batteries were PAO Saturn LIGP-50 lithium-ion cells, the first flight test of a new Russian military lithium-ion architecture designed for long-duration classified missions. The inertial navigation system came from NPK Optolink, Vobis 1 and Vobis 2 fiber optic gyroscopes, immune to GLONASS jamming, immune to solar weather, immune to any countermeasure NATO could throw at it from the ground. And the payload itself, the actual reason the satellite existed, was a radio frequency interception package from the Radio Research and Development Institute, NII Radio of Moscow. Built around a parabolic antenna roughly 2.2 meters in diameter, made of carbon fiber and aluminum honeycomb, weighing no more than 14 kilograms, and capable of tuning into the L-band, C-band, and Ku-band uplinks of any commercial communications satellite within 0.1 degrees of longitude. That last specification is the entire story. Hold on to it. 0.1 degrees of longitude. At geostationary altitude, that translates to roughly 70 kilometers. And 70 kilometers, in the geometry of microwave radio, is not proximity. It is absorption. Chapter 2. The 0.1 degree doctrine. Forget what you think you know about how spies steal secrets. Olymp-K did not hack anything. It did not break encryption. It did not need to. The way a geostationary uplink works is this. A ground station, let's say the operations center of Eutelsat in Paris, or the Italian Ministry of Defense in Rome, or NATO's communications hub in Brussels, points a parabolic dish at the sky and beams a tightly focused microwave signal at its satellite, 35,786 kilometers up. The dish is engineered to a beam width of typically 0.5 to 2 degrees. That sounds narrow. It is not. By the time the signal climbs to geostationary altitude, the cone of usable radio energy has spread out to a footprint hundreds of kilometers across. Inside that cone, any sufficiently sensitive receiver hears everything the ground station is sending up: telemetry, encrypted command instructions, encrypted payload data, and the parts of the header that are still, on older satellites, transmitted in the clear. If you are an eavesdropping satellite, parked 70 kilometers off-axis from the legitimate target, 0.1 degrees of longitude away, you are not near the conversation. You are sitting in the row behind the conversation, recording every word. You are not eavesdropping. You are absorbing. This is what the Russians built. This is what they parked next to 30 different commercial satellites for 11 years. And here is the part the rest of the world refused to understand for years. End-to-end encryption protects content. It does not protect pattern. An astute analyst, logging months of encrypted traffic from inside the uplink cone, can infer enormous quantities of operational intelligence without ever decrypting a single packet. Traffic volume tells you when an organization is busy, and therefore when an operation is being planned. Channel hopping patterns tell you which frequencies are reserved for crisis traffic, and therefore which channels matter most when a war begins. Carrier wave shifts and Doppler signatures tell you which ground station is talking, and therefore the physical location of the command authority. And on older European military and commercial satellites, the command link headers, the unencrypted instructions used by ground operators to maneuver, reorient, and reconfigure their own satellites, are still, in 2026, transmitted in the clear. That last vulnerability is the payoff. In February 2026, Major General Michael Traut, commander of Germany's Space Command, told the Financial Times that Russian satellites are likely intercepting the command links of older European spacecraft. The implication which Trout did not state directly, but which every defense analyst in Europe understood instantly, is that a country that has logged enough command link traffic can replay the commands. If you send up the right imposter signal, you do not need a kinetic weapon to disable a satellite. You can simply tell the satellite, in its own command vocabulary, to deorbit itself. The German space commander did not say this out loud. He did not have to. Olymp-K had been making the case for him, in orbit, for 11 years. Chapter 3. The First Anomaly, 18.1 degrees west. By the time the world figured out what Olymp-K was actually doing, it was already in position. After 7 months of patient station-keeping drift from its transfer orbit, the satellite arrived at 18.1 degrees west longitude on the 4th of April, 2015. The position was chosen with surgical precision. At that slot in the geostationary belt sat 2 commercial communication satellites belonging to the Luxembourg American Consortium, Intelsat. Intelsat 7 at 18.2 degrees west and Intelsat 901 at 18 degrees west. The 2 birds were less than half a degree apart, and the Russian satellite slipped between them with a margin of roughly 10 kilometers. In October 2015, the journalist Mike Gruss at Space News broke the story. K. Sears, then president of Intelsat General, gave him the kind of statement that satellite executives almost never give. "This is not normal behavior, and we're concerned." Intelsat attempted to contact the satellite's operator directly and through the United States Department of Defense, and received no reply. Captain Nicholas Mercurio, then spokesman for the U.S. Joint Functional Component Command for Space, told Space News on the record, "On 3 occasions, Olymp-K came within 5 kilometers of an Intelsat satellite." An industry source tried immediately to soften the disclosure by claiming the numbers were extrapolated from drift rate predictions rather than direct measurements. But the very fact that the U.S. military was disputing the precision of the encounter in public was itself the disclosure. A foreign military satellite had drifted into the operational keep-out zone of a commercial American broadcaster, and the United States government had been forced to acknowledge it because the operator had gone to the press first. That was the end of Orbital Sanctuary. Not on the 1st of May 2026, at the 13-kilometer pass between a Russian inspector and a U.S. GSSAP. Not in April 2024, at the 3-meter rendezvous between Cosmos 2581 and Cosmos 2583. Orbital Sanctuary ended on the 4th of April 2015 at 18.1 degrees west longitude, when no one outside the satellite tracking community was looking. The treaty assumption that 36,000 kilometers of altitude was its own defense, that no nation would bother sending a spy to a place that expensive to reach, collapsed in silence 11 years before the world admitted it. Chapter 4. 30 hideouts in 11 years. The Beat Doctrine. What happened next was not anomalous behavior. It was a doctrine. Drawing on the meticulous reconstruction work of the Center for Strategic and International Studies and Anatoly Zak's Russian Spaceweb Archive, we can rebuild the satellite's wandering with date and longitude precision. Between October and December 2014, it drifted slowly eastward from 65 degrees east to 52.8 degrees east. In February 2015, it accelerated across 78 degrees, then 83, then 92, arriving at 96.4 degrees east by the 21st of February. From April to September 2015, it sat between the 2 Intelsat satellites at 18.1 degrees west. In September 2015, it moved to 24.4 degrees west, adjacent to Intelsat 905. In January 2016, it shifted to 1 degree west, adjacent to Intelsat 1002. Throughout 2016 and 2017, it executed repeated eastward drift cycles, each pause matched to a different commercial broadcaster. In August and September 2019, it parked near Intelsat 17 at 66 degrees east. In December 2019, it moved to 70.6 degrees east, adjacent to Russian and Indian government communications birds. In February 2021, it reached 8.1 degrees west, the 25th distinct geostationary position the satellite had occupied in 6 years. In March 2021, a Dutch archaeologist named Marco Langbroek, by training a scholar of ancient artifacts, by vocation an amateur astronomer, and by profession a lecturer at Delft University of Technology, pointed a backyard telescope at the geostationary belt above the Netherlands and captured 2 small dots of reflected sunlight side by side. The dots were Olymp-K and the French commercial communications satellite Eutelsat 8 West B, separated by roughly 70 kilometers in orbital space. The photograph is not technically impressive. It is 2 pixels of light in a black field. It is one of the most important photographs ever taken of a Russian military operation, because it was taken by a man with no security clearance, no government salary, and no institutional support, working from his own back garden. The wandering did not stop. In the summer of 2022, just months after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Olymp-K relocated back to 18 degrees west to monitor European telecommunications traffic during the opening months of the war. Between 2023 and early 2025, it maintained station near multiple European and Mediterranean broadcasters, including at least 1 documented approach within 0.075 degrees, 55 kilometers, of a NATO-affiliated satellite. In March 2025, it departed for 65.5 degrees east. And between the 7th and the 22nd of October 2025, it executed the perigee-raising burns that pushed it 300 kilometers above geostationary orbit into the supersynchronous disposal regime, the graveyard belt. 30 distinct geostationary positions in 11 years and 1 month. No commercial satellite in the history of the geostationary belt has done anything remotely similar. The median commercial geosatellite stays within a 75-kilometer station-keeping box for its entire 15-year service life. Olymp-K crossed entire hemispheres. And at every stop, it parked next to a commercial neighbor whose uplink it could intercept. This was not station-keeping. This was a beat. Each pause was calibrated to a target's uplink geometry. Each drift was optimized for coverage overlap. The Russians had not built a satellite. They had built a signals intelligence sweep, and they had been running it through the rooftop of European secure communications for the better part of a decade and a half. Chapter 5. The Minister Who Named the Ghost. On the 7th of September 2018, the French Minister of the Armed Forces, Florence Parly, did something her predecessors had spent decades carefully avoiding. She named the satellite. She named the target. She named the killer. Standing at the lectern of the École de l'Air, France's Air Force Academy, Parly delivered a sentence that broke a 40-year diplomatic silence. "This little Star Wars," she said, "didn't take place a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. It was a year ago, 36,000 kilometers above our heads. And this big-eared satellite, it is called Luch Olymp, a well-known Russian satellite, but a little indiscreet. We saw it coming, and we took the measures that were necessary. We are monitoring it closely. The satellite Pahley was talking about had crept up over the course of 2017 on Athena Fides, a Franco-Italian secure communications satellite jointly operated by the French Directorate General of Armaments and the Italian Ministry of Defense, launched in February 2014, dedicated to carrying encrypted bandwidth for NATO operational planning, French overseas military deployments, and Italian command and control. An act of espionage, Pahley called it. It was the first time in the post-Cold War era that a Western defense minister had publicly accused another nuclear-armed power of in-orbit espionage against operational military communications. The Russian Foreign Ministry denied everything. The Russian Defense Ministry declined to comment. And the satellite, with all the indifference of a piece of orbital hardware that does not read newspapers, simply kept going. It went on for 7 more years. Act 3. The Death and the Aftermath. Chapter 6. The Retirement. October 2025. By the autumn of 2025, Olymp-K had exhausted its operational utility. 11 years and 1 month of continuous Hall-effect maneuvering had bled even its electric propulsion tanks dry. The solar panels had been degraded by a decade of geostationary radiation exposure. And, most importantly, Olymp-K2 had been operational for 2.5 years by then, with newer electronics, broader frequency coverage, and a more aggressive proximity operations doctrine. The predecessor was redundant. Between the 7th and the 22nd of October 2025, the satellite executed a series of perigee-raising burns from its operational altitude of 35,786 kilometers into a supersynchronous disposal orbit several hundred kilometers above the geostationary ring. This is the procedure recommended by the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee, the IADC, for end-of-life geosatellites. The logic is simple. Rather than leaving the dead bird in the operational ring where it could collide with an active spacecraft, you push it up and out, into a region where, theoretically, nothing else operates. There is one critical word in that procedure: passivation. Properly retired satellites are supposed to vent all residual fuel, drain their batteries to a state of permanent discharge, and depressurize their internal systems before being parked in the graveyard. The reason is straightforward and merciless. The residual chemical energy of a dead satellite is a bomb waiting to go off. A micrometeoroid impact, a thermal cycling anomaly, a hairline crack in a pressurized propellant tank, a partially charged lithium-ion battery that has spent 10 years in vacuum. Any of these can rupture the spacecraft and disperse its mass as a debris field across the disposal regime. We do not know whether Olymp-K was properly passivated. The Russian Ministry of Defense has never publicly stated that it was. The Russian Ministry of Defense has never publicly stated anything about Olymp-K, before or after. The October 2025 retirement was registered only by Western trackers: Aldoria, Russian Spaceweb, the 18th Space Defense Squadron Catalog. Roscosmos's press service, which for 11 years had described the satellite as a civilian Luch data relay, simply stopped issuing updates. The ghost was buried in silence. 3 months later, the silence broke. Chapter 7. The Break. 6:09:03 UTC. At 0552 hours Coordinated Universal Time on January 30th, 2026, 17 minutes before the event, the Swiss astronomical surveillance company S2A Systems registered a clean, stable photometric signature for NORAD 40258. The brightness curve was flat. The rotational period was steady and predictable. The satellite was intact, drifting passively in its disposal orbit, with one face pointing toward the sun. 300 kilometers above the operational ring of the geostationary belt, the dead spy was behaving exactly as a dead spy should. At 060903, 6 hours, 9 minutes, and 3 seconds universal time, that satellite ceased to be a satellite. Aldoria, the French commercial space surveillance startup whose network of 6 optical telescopes spans France, Spain, Australia, India, and Chile, caught the moment with sub-second precision. It was a fragmentation event, the company's incident report stated. 23 minutes later, at 6:32 UTC, the same ground network resolved at least 3 discrete objects clustered around the position where one had been. The relative velocity dispersion between the fragments was large enough that within minutes, the cluster was no longer a single signature. By 6:55 UTC, the main body was no longer responding to anticipated attitude profiles. By the next clear observation pass, it was flashing with a photometric period of 27.9 seconds, the unmistakable signature of an uncontrolled tumble. 3 hours later, the astronomer royal of orbital cataloging, Jonathan McDowell of the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, a man who has personally cataloged more orbital objects than any other human being alive, was reached by Space.com. McDowell was unequivocal. This may be a worrying event, and disintegration may have been caused by an external debris impact, he said. When it was retired, internal energy sources, such as fuel and batteries, should have been vented. McDowell's warning was the one sentence the rest of the analysis depended on. A passivated satellite has no residual chemical energy. A passivated satellite does not spontaneously fragment 3 months into its disposal orbit. If McDowell was right, and his 3 decades of orbital debris cataloging suggest he is, then something hit Olymp-K. And that something was an untracked object in a graveyard orbit that the global space surveillance network was not watching closely enough to see coming. This is the moment the orbital black box wants you to sit with for 30 seconds. Because the next sentence is the entire reason this video exists. The graveyard above geostationary orbit, the supersynchronous disposal regime 300 kilometers above the most valuable real estate in space, is not a cemetery. It is an unmonitored battlefield. And we have just received forensic confirmation that there are lethal kinetic threats in it that no government catalog contains. Consider what the 27.9-second tumble actually means as a forensic diagnostic. No other public analysis of the Olymp-K event has treated the photometric period as an angular momentum fingerprint, but it is one. For a 3,000-kilogram satellite with deployed solar panels and antenna booms, a stable rotation period of 27.9 seconds is consistent with a very specific class of impact event. A non-central, high-energy strike on the main body, not on the solar arrays, imparts a torque vector that the satellite's flexible appendages then dampen into a coherent, periodic tumble. If the impact had been low energy, the spacecraft would have absorbed it without fragmenting at all. If the impact had been catastrophic and central, the spacecraft would have shattered into a chaotic, non-periodic dispersion with no measurable rotation period. The 27.9 seconds sits between those two extremes. It is the signature of a kinetic event large enough to fragment structural elements, but small enough that the main body survived and the appendages acted as inertial dampers. McDowell's analysis of passivation removes the internal failure scenario. What is left is an external impactor. Something hit it. Something that was not in any government catalog, that no surveillance system had been watching, that was, by definition, untracked at the moment of impact. because if it had been tracked, the operators of Olymp-K's disposal orbit would have been warned, even posthumously, by the 18th Space Defense Squadron or the European Union's Space Surveillance and Tracking Consortium. There was no warning. There has been no post-event identification of the impactor. The object that killed Olymp-K is still in the graveyard regime, somewhere, still on the trajectory that produced the collision, and no one on Earth can name it. That is what an unmonitored battlefield looks like. That is the operational meaning of the passivation paradox. Chapter 8. The Three Paradoxes. Why this matters. There are three paradoxes embedded in the death of Olymp-K that no other coverage of this event has articulated. Each one of them is, by itself, a reason for the European Space Agency, the United States Space Force, NATO, and the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs to convene an emergency working group. Together, they describe the collapse of a 60-year set of assumptions about how human civilization operates in geostationary orbit. The first paradox is the passivation paradox. A satellite that was supposed to be dead exploded. If Jonathan McDowell's analysis is correct, the death of Olymp-K is forensic proof that the GEO graveyard contains kinetic threats untracked by any government catalog. The attic is not a cemetery. It is a battlefield, and the bodies in it are not still. The second paradox is the proximity paradox. For 11 years, Olymp-K proved that the geostationary belt is transparent. A single 3,000-kilogram machine could park within 10 kilometers of any target and drink its electromagnetic soul without ever touching it. That was an invisible threat, an intelligence threat, a sovereignty threat, a treaty vacuum threat. Then the satellite died, and in dying, it converted itself from an invisible threat into a physical one. 3,000 kilograms of structural debris are now drifting in the exact altitude band where no active satellite can maneuver to avoid them. The third paradox is the sovereignty paradox. The most significant military space event of early 2026, the public disintegration of a major Russian military signals intelligence platform in orbit, was not first reported by the United States Space Force. It was reported by Aldoria, a French commercial startup with $10.9 million United States dollars in Series A funding, 6 optical telescopes, and a Series A pitch deck that did not exist 5 years ago. The death of Olymp-K marks the moment European space situational awareness achieved operational independence from American orbital intelligence. It also marks the moment Russia lost the ability to hide its catastrophic failures in orbit. The Kremlin has not, as of mid-May 2026, acknowledged that NORAD 4258 has changed orbital status. The Russian Ministry of Defense has issued no comment. Roscosmos has been silent. None of it matters. The fragments are not in the dark anymore. The European surveillance architecture that did not exist 5 years ago catalogs, tracks, and publicly documents them. And the Russian Foreign Ministry cannot intimidate, sanction, or jam it. Chapter 9. The Graveyard Problem. Why 300 kilometers is not enough. The Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee Mitigation Guideline recommends that defunct geostationary satellites be disposed of in orbits between 235 and 300 kilometers above the operational ring. The guideline was written in the late 1990s under 3 assumptions: that orbital velocities in the graveyard are lower than in low Earth orbit, that atmospheric drag is negligible at 36,000 kilometers, and that objects in the disposal regime will simply coast forever. All 3 assumptions are true. All 3 assumptions are also irrelevant to the actual physics of long-term debris evolution above geostationary altitude. Olymp-K's debris field is now subject to 4 perturbation vectors that, over the coming years and decades, will inject fragments back into the operational ring. The first is solar radiation pressure. For objects with high area-to-mass ratios, solar panels, antenna booms, thermal blankets, anything thin and reflective, the constant pressure of sunlight produces eccentricity oscillations on multi-year timescales. A fragment with an area-to-mass ratio greater than 0.01 square meters per kilogram can experience perigee drops of 50 to 100 kilometers within 5 to 10 years. That is enough to drop debris into the active belt. The second vector is lunisolar gravitational perturbation. The combined gravity of the Moon and the Sun induces cyclic inclination and eccentricity changes in supersynchronous orbits. And over decades, these effects can lower perigee into the operational ring. The third is Earth's oblateness, the equatorial bulge, which causes nodal regression that slowly alters orbital geometry. And the fourth, and most insidious, is fragment-fragment collision risk. The graveyard regime is estimated by the European Space Agency to contain at least 300 disposal-class objects, plus an unknown number of untracked debris pieces, a population that just received an unquantified contribution from the disintegration of Olymp-K. Unlike low Earth orbit, where atmospheric drag eventually deorbits debris and cleans the regime over decades, the geo-graveyard has no natural sink. The fragments stay. They drift. They collide with each other, occasionally, in random encounters that produce more fragments. They are perturbed back toward the operational ring on timescales of years to centuries. And no commercial or governmental organization on Earth has any active program to remove them. The risk is not immediate. It is stochastic and compounding. Each day Olymp-K's debris field exists is a day that probability of a future collision with a still active satellite accumulates. Darren McKnight, senior technical fellow at Leo Labs and one of the world's leading authorities on orbital debris dynamics, was the analyst who first detected the November 2024 uncontrolled tumble of Cosmos 2553, Russia's suspected nuclear anti-satellite testbed, using his company's Doppler radar network. McKnight has been warning publicly for years that the high-altitude graveyard regime is dangerously under-monitored. The Olymp-K incident is, in his terms, the operational validation of that warning. The graveyard debris environment is worse than the public data indicates. The graveyard surveillance architecture is structurally insufficient. And nobody, not the United States, not the European Union, not the United Nations, not any commercial operator on Earth, has a remediation plan for geo-altitude debris. There is no commercial market for cleanup at 36,000 kilometers. The fragments will stay where they are, drifting in the dark, occasionally disturbed, occasionally sinking toward the active ring, until something or someone takes it upon themselves to act. And no one is getting ready. Act 4. The Systemic Implications. Chapter 10. The successor is still listening. While the world was processing the fragmentation of the original Olymp-K, its successor was still in orbit, still operating, still listening. On the 12th of March 2023, at 23 hours 12 minutes Universal Time, a second Proton-M Briz-M heavy launcher had lifted off from the same launch pad at Baikonur, Site 239. Carrying a satellite designated Luch 5X by the Russian Ministry of Defense, catalogued as NORAD 55841 by the United States Space Force, identified in American intelligence reporting as Olymp-K-2, and known inside ISS Reshetnev project documents as Yenisei-2, internal project number 763. Western intelligence assessments of the satellite, compiled from procurement records, IEEE Explore filings, Academic papers from the Keldysh Research Center and Bart Hendricks' forensic work in the Space Review describe an evolutionary platform with significantly enhanced payload electronics. At its heart is the MAGD-O L-band receiver, covering 1.5 to 2.5 gigahertz with a data output rate of 250 megabits per second, coupled to a multiplexing and scrambling system designated MPS, capable of handling 320 megabits per second of intercepted traffic. The satellite is, in every meaningful sense, a more aggressive version of its predecessor, and much of it was built with Western components. This is the part of the story that converts orbital espionage into a supply chain crisis. Hendricks' procurement research, drawing on customs declarations, end-user certificates, and zakupki.gov.ru tender documents, identifies semiconductors in Olymp-K from at least 6 Western suppliers: Firadec, 3D+, STM, Intersil, Xilinx, and International Rectifier, every one of whose products is subject to United States export controls. These components reached Russia after the 2022 American sanctions on ISS Reshetnev and the 2023 European Union sanctions on the same entity, via intermediary companies in third countries, false end-user certificates, and customs misdeclaration. The route from the American semiconductor factory to the Russian spy satellite is not classified. It is a paper trail of shell companies and false documentation that any sufficiently patient analyst can reconstruct. It is the same supply chain logic that turned industrial refrigeration units into Shahed drone engines, that turned commercial GPS modules into Iranian artillery guidance kits, and that has, repeatedly, been documented in Russian cruise missiles recovered from Ukraine. The only difference in the case of Olymp-K is altitude. The dual-use commodity, the false end-user certificate, the regulatory blind spot, they all behave identically at 360,000 meters above the equator as they do at street level in Tehran. Between the launch of Olymp-K in April 2023 and the Financial Times exclusive published on the 4th of February 2026, the satellite tracked at least 17 European satellites, hovering within 20 to 200 kilometers of each target for periods ranging from days to weeks. Aldoria's tracking logs document the specific encounters. On the 12th of April 2024, Olymp-K made a 10-kilometer approach to an unnamed geostationary satellite. In early July 2024, it conducted an 80-kilometer approach to a Norwegian commercial broadcaster operated by Telenor, gradually closing to 20 kilometers over a period of weeks. It sustained shadowing operations against Intelsat 10002. Breaking Defense reported in October 2023 an approach to Eutelsat 3B within approximately 18 kilometers. Major General Michael Trout's February 2026 disclosure to the Financial Times that European security services suspected Olymp-K was eavesdropping on the command links of at least a dozen key satellites was the first time a NATO defense official had publicly named an ongoing orbital espionage operation. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius told the same outlet that satellites are the Achilles heel of modern societies, and that an attack in orbit could paralyze entire nations. Olymp-K, the original, had been in its graveyard orbit for 3 months when the FT story broke. 5 days later, it would come apart. The Financial Times did not name all 17 satellites. Working from the FT disclosure, Aldoria's published tracking, the photometric observations of Marco Langbroek, the analysis of Bart Hendricks, and operator advisories collected by SES, Eutelsat, Intelsat, Telenor, and Inmarsat, we can identify or constrain at least the following targets approached by Olymp-K and Olymp-K2 between 2014 and 2026. Intelsat 7, Intelsat 901, Intelsat 905, Intelsat 10-02, Intelsat 17, Intelsat 10002, the Franco-Italian secure communications satellite Athena Fidus, the European broadband relay satellite KA-SAT, photographed in 2023 by Langbroek alongside Olymp-K2, Eutelsat 9B, Eutelsat 8 West B, the satellite Langbroek captured in March 2021, Eutelsat 3B, approached within roughly 18 kilometers in October 2023. Multiple Norwegian Telenor commercial satellites. Likely targets, based on orbital geometry, include members of the French Syracuse and Italian Seacrawl military communications constellations, NATO-affiliated commercial broadband relays, and the Inmarsat 4 and Inmarsat 5 series. The pattern matters more than any individual target. Olymp-K and Olymp-K2 systematically targeted European commercial satellites that carry military lease bandwidth, secure communications channels purchased by NATO and EU member states from commercial operators because their own military constellations are insufficient. Every one of those leased channels has been, at one point or another, in the uplink beam of a Russian FSB-tasked spy satellite parked 70 kilometers away. Chapter 11. The Tobol Connection. Ground Game. To understand why the death of Olymp-K is more than a debris event, you have to look at it inside the wider architecture of Russia's electromagnetic battlespace. The Tobol electronic warfare system, operated by the 841st Separate Electronic Warfare Center based in Kaliningrad, and sanctioned by the European Union on the 15th of July 2025, is capable of jamming the GPS, Galileo, and GLONASS satellite navigation signals within a radius of approximately 300 kilometers. It can also spoof those signals, feeding false position information to receivers that believe they are listening to the real constellations. And it can conduct direction finding against NATO emitters across the Baltic theater. In June 2025 alone, Lithuania officially recorded 1,073 GPS jamming incidents. That is 22 times the number recorded in the same month a year earlier. Estonia reported that, during the same period, 85% of flights into the country experienced GPS malfunctions. Poland recorded 2,732 distinct jamming events in January 2025 alone. Across the first 4 months of 2026, the combined Baltic states registered approximately 123,000 instances of GPS jamming. This is not background noise. This is sustained, doctrinal electromagnetic warfare against the navigation infrastructure of NATO's eastern flank. The 841st makes the noise on the ground. The Luch and Olymp satellites pick up the signal in space. Together they form what Russian military theorists call radio-electronic suppression, radioelektronное подавление, or PEP in transliterated Cyrillic, a doctrine that requires no destruction, only degradation. The 841st jams the GPS of a NATO aircraft over the Baltic. The aircraft switches to a backup satellite communications channel. The backup channel is intercepted by a Luch satellite in geostationary orbit. Russia maps the entire electromagnetic failover architecture of the alliance, command channel by command channel, without firing a single shot. The integrated kill chain did not stop on January 30th, 2026. Olymp-K2 continues the SIGINT mission with newer electronics and broader frequency coverage. The 841st Center continues jamming from Kaliningrad. The architecture is alive. But the death of Olymp-K did one thing the architects of the system probably did not anticipate. It scattered fragments at altitudes that intersect the future operational orbits of Western inspector satellites, including the U.S. Space Force's GSSAP Geostationary Surveillance constellation and its planned successors. American satellites now have to navigate around a debris field born from the death of a Russian satellite that had been watching them. The hunter has become the hazard. Chapter 12. The Treaty That Cannot Hold. To understand why nothing concrete will happen as a consequence of the death of Olymp-K, you have to read the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. Article 9 requires states to carry out their space activities with due regard to the corresponding interests of all other states' parties. It contains no specific prohibition on close approaches, no specific prohibition on signals interception, no specific prohibition on debris generation, and no specific requirement of proper passivation. It is a gentleman's agreement, written by Cold War diplomats who could not have imagined the operational density of the modern geostationary belt. Article 4 prohibits weapons of mass destruction in space, a clause Russia voted on the 24th of April, 2024, to prevent from being strengthened. The Security Council resolution failed 13 votes to 1-1, with China abstaining and Russia exercising its veto. Russian Ambassador Vasily Nebenzia justified the veto by accusing the West of actively exploring outer space for military purposes. A technically accurate observation, since the United States GSSAP constellation performs the same close approach maneuvers Olymp-K did, but one that confuses equivalence with justification. There is no treaty mechanism that can compel Russia to explain what happened to Olymp-K. There is no verification regime for end-of-life passivation. Orbital debris creation is not subject to international arbitration. The IADC mitigation guidelines are non-binding. The Working Group on Long-Term Sustainability of the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, COPUOS, works by consensus, and Russia is part of the consensus. The Outer Space Treaty was written under the assumption that space would remain sparsely populated, that the major powers would self-regulate out of mutual interest, and that violations would be too operationally expensive to be worth attempting. All three assumptions are dead. Nations can claim compliance with peaceful use while deploying platforms specifically designed to exploit the treaty's silence. Olymp-K was, legally, a civilian Luch data relay satellite. Operationally, it was the most prolific geosignals intelligence platform ever built. The gap between legal fiction and physical reality is the exploit Russia has perfected. And the treaty is structurally incapable of closing it. Chapter 13. The Aldoria Network. Why a French startup is now the world's eye. There is a quieter story buried inside this story, and it deserves its own paragraph. 5 years ago, the French commercial space situational awareness company that captured the Olymp-K fragmentation with sub-second precision was not a household name. The company, originally founded as Share My Space, was rebranded as Aldoria in 2024 after a Series A funding round of $10.9 million United States dollars. It operates a network of 6 optical telescope stations across France, Spain, Australia, India, and Chile, generating roughly 10 maneuver detections per month for each object in a catalog of 25,000 tracked objects. In November 2025, Aldoria signed a €12 million partnership with ONERA, the French National Aerospace Research Lab, to deploy the Ramses program. 5 multi-telescope, multispectral observation stations across the globe, designed in the program's own language to detect, identify, characterize, and locate all space objects. The strategic purpose is sovereignty. For more than 30 years, the global space surveillance community has depended almost exclusively on United States Space Force tracking data, on the 18th Space Defense Squadron catalog of objects, on the ComSpock commercial extensions to that catalog, and on the Space Domain Awareness Fusion Cell at Vandenberg. European space surveillance was an afterthought. That dependence was not just operational, it was diplomatic and intelligence political. When a major Russian satellite maneuvered in orbit, European governments did not learn about it from their own sensors. They learned about it from a phone call with U.S. Space Command, or from a briefing in the Combined Space Operations Center at Vandenberg, or from a controlled disclosure in a Space News article authorized by the U.S. Department of Defense. The chain of trust ran through Washington. The strategic implication, which European defense ministries spent 2 decades quietly resenting, was that Europe's understanding of what was happening above its head was filtered, selected, and timed by the United States government. After the 2018 Florence Parly speech at the École de l'Air, France began the long process of building an independent space surveillance architecture. Aldoria, ONERA, the Ramses program, the Cosmos operational system, the wider European Union space strategy for security and defense. All of it traces back, in part, to the realization that Athena Fidus had been shadowed for a year before Paris was in a position to even know it was happening with certainty. The Olymp-K fragmentation was the first major orbital event of the 2026 calendar year to be detected, reported, and contextualized in real time by a European commercial network, rather than by the United States military. With the support of ONERA, the French operational space surveillance system Cosmos, and the broader European Union space strategy for security and defense, France has demonstrated that it can independently monitor, log, and interpret a major Russian military satellite's death in real time. Europe no longer requires Washington's permission to know what is happening 36,000 kilometers above its own head. The forensic expertise that documented the final hours of Olymp-K will document the next compromise, and the one after that, and almost certainly the next event in which someone else's Western satellite is targeted. Russia cannot intimidate this architecture. Russia cannot sanction this architecture. Russia cannot jam this architecture. And, as the silence from the Kremlin in the 4 months since the disintegration demonstrates, Russia cannot any longer afford catastrophic failures in orbit without external witnesses. Chapter 14. The Amateur Architecture. The First Layer. Above and beneath the Aldoria network sits the foundational layer of European space surveillance. It is a community of perhaps a few dozen amateur astronomers scattered across 3 continents, with no clearances, no government salaries, no institutional support, and no telescopes more expensive than a used family car. The Dutch archaeologist Marco Langbroek, photographing Olymp-K from his back garden in the Netherlands. The South African amateur tracker Greg Roberts. The Dutch astronomer Kees Bassa. Their backyard photographs, taken patiently since 2014, are the only public visual record of what Olymp-K was doing for 11 years. The United States Space Force does not release images of foreign military satellites. Commercial satellite operators do not release images of their own satellites being stalked. The only way the world has been able to see what Olymp-K was doing is because a handful of civilians, pointing modest optics at the geostationary belt, recorded what they saw and posted it on personal blogs and ResearchGate uploads. When Olymp-K fragmented at 6:09:03 UTC, the first images came from S2A systems and Aldoria within minutes. Jonathan McDowell published his first contextual analysis within hours. A full forensic timeline was assembled by amateurs and commercial trackers within 48 hours. 4 months later, the Russian Ministry of Defense had still not acknowledged the event. This is what an open-source intelligence ecosystem looks like at full operational capability. Olymp-K's death was, paradoxically, the most public moment of its entire life. The satellite had spent 11 years hiding in plain sight from the official world. It died in plain sight of the unofficial one. Act 5. The Hinge. Chapter 15. The Wider Pattern. Russia's failing satellites are telling us something. If you stack the high-value Russian space failures of the past 18 months onto a single timeline, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. In November 2024, Cosmos 2553, Russia's suspected nuclear anti-satellite testbed, began an uncontrolled tumble in a 2,000-kilometer orbit inside the inner Van Allen radiation belt, detected by the Leo Labs Doppler radar network and confirmed by Slingshot Aerospace optical tracking. The satellite, launched in February 2022, just weeks before the invasion of Ukraine, now spins with a rotation period of roughly 2.2 seconds. Its solar panels and antennae catching and releasing sunlight as it spirals slowly downward. In April 2025, France 24 and Reuters confirmed that Cosmos 2553 was spinning uncontrollably. In October 2025, Olymp-K was retired from GEO to its disposal orbit. On the 30th of January 2026, at 6:09:03 UTC, Olymp-K fragmented. On the 4th of February 2026, the Financial Times disclosed the 17-satellite stalking file. On the 5th of February 2026, at 18:29 UTC, a Soyuz Tu-1B lifted off from Plesetsk Site 43, carrying 9 military payloads. Cosmos 2602 through Cosmos 2610, including suspected BARS-M optical reconnaissance satellites, Lotos S signals intelligence satellites, and small Mojayets technology demonstrators. In March 2026, Reuters and Ukrainian military intelligence documented 24 Russian satellite surveys across 11 Middle Eastern countries, correlating in time with Iranian missile and drone strikes against United States troops and CIA infrastructure. On the 28th of April 2026, Cosmos 2581 and Cosmos 2583 conducted a 3-meter rendezvous in low Earth orbit at 17,500 miles per hour, closer than the formal docking standards of the International Space Station. On the 1st of May 2026, at 2100 Zulu, the Russian Nivalier-class inspector Cosmos 2589 and the U.S. GSSAP-6 spacecraft USA 325 passed within 13 kilometers of each other in the geostationary belt. On the 12th of May 2026, at 11:15 Moscow time, Russia test-fired the RS-28 Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile from Plesetsk on a flight profile that exploited a known southern hemisphere blind spot in the U.S. space-based infrared system early warning constellation. On the 13th of May 2026, China's TJS-3 satellite maneuvered to inspect Gaofen 1302 in geostationary orbit, practicing the same inspection doctrine Olymp-K had rehearsed for 11 years. And on the 17th of May 2026, China's state broadcaster CGTN announced a major China-Russia satellite navigation roadmap, merging the GLONASS and Beidou architectures into a coordinated counter-GPS framework. That list is not a list. It is an inventory. A sustained, coordinated, multi-domain expansion of Russian and Chinese counterspace activity, in which individual events, like the death of Olymp-K, are not isolated curiosities, but data points in a doctrine. The doctrine has a name, and it is the third original framework this video has offered. We call it Operate, Absorb, Replace. Operate aggressively. Deploy proximity operations, jamming, and interception platforms with no regard for hardware longevity. Absorb the failures. Cosmos 2553 dies in the radiation belt because it was deliberately put in the radiation belt. Olymp-K is destroyed because it was deliberately operated in a regime of orders of magnitude greater collision exposure. Both are doctrinal acceptance of attrition. Then replace. Procure the next generation through gray market supply chains and false end-user certificates. The Olymp-K2 successor is in orbit now. A third platform, speculated to be Olymp-K3, or a distinct successor designated Yenisei A1, has been linked to procurement contracts at ISS Reshetnev for delivery in 2028. The platform is moving. The mission does not. Chapter 16. What Europe now has to do, and will probably not do. The Olymp-K event imposes a European space policy that European governments will probably spend the next decade trying to ignore. On the 3rd of February 2026, the day before the Financial Times published its 17-satellite exclusive, Reuters reported that Germany was eyeing lasers, spy satellites, in an aggressive new military space spending package, an unprecedented public commitment by Berlin to field its own counterspace capabilities. The United Kingdom's Strategic Defence Review 2025 had already identified the need to deploy self-defense options in space. The European Union's Space Strategy for Security and Defense, published in 2023 and progressively implemented through the Galileo Navigation Program, the IRIS-squared Secure Connectivity Constellation, and the proposed European Counterspace Initiative, calls for an integrated European response. The Olymp-K event proves that strategic announcements are not operational capabilities. European satellites with unencrypted command links are not future vulnerabilities awaiting future defenses. They are actively exploited vulnerabilities that have existed for 11 years and 4 months. Fixing them is not a next budget cycle capability. It is an emergency purchase. The doctrinal divide between defensive monitoring and offensive response is not an academic debate. It is a treaty problem that has already produced an attic full of fragments, and the attic sits directly above Europe's most valuable orbital infrastructure. The likely European response, historically, will be what it has always been against military space threats: a strongly worded communiqué, an additional sanctions tranche against the 841st EW Center and selected ISS Reshetnev officials, and a procurement timeline that delivers operational capabilities in 2032 or later. In that interval, the Russian Federation will continue operating Olymp-K2 at its current tempo, will retire it to the graveyard regime when its useful life ends, will encounter the same passivation hazard that Olymp-K apparently encountered, and will replace it with Olymp-K3 or equivalent. The cycle, even after the death of Olymp-K, continues. The cycle is confirmed. Chapter 17. The Civilizational Hinge. For 11 years and 4 months, Olymp-K listened to NATO. It did not disrupt NATO communications. It did not blow up any satellites. It did not break any treaty whose words are enforceable. It simply parked itself, over and over again, in the uplink beams of European commercial broadcasters, carrying military lease bandwidth. It recorded what was said. It sent the recordings down to ground stations operated by the FSB and the Russian Ministry of Defense. The total volume of intercepted traffic over those 11 years is unknown, but presumed to be enormous. The intelligence value of that traffic is unknowable from open sources, but the operational tempo of Russian electromagnetic warfare against European aviation, maritime, and financial infrastructure during 2024, 2025, and 2026, the 123,000 jamming incidents in the Baltic, the directed strikes correlated with Russian satellite passes over Iranian forces, the consistent degradation of Galileo and GPS over the eastern flank, strongly suggests it was substantial. The satellite that did all of this is now a tumbling wreck in an orbital cemetery, fragmenting on a 27.9-second photometric beat that loops endlessly, like a metronome. Its successor still listens. The procurement contract for its successor's successor is in the open files on zakupki.gov.ru, scheduled for delivery in 2028. All 550 active satellites in the geostationary belt, including the American AEHF and SBIRS spacecraft that carry nuclear command and control traffic, the European Syracuse, Sicrel, and Athena Fidus military communications satellites that route NATO operational planning, and the commercial broadcasters that deliver television to 1.2 billion households and route an estimated 12 trillion United States dollars per day in financial transactions, are, by definition, vulnerable to the same proximity eavesdropping doctrine Olymp-K perfected over the course of 11 years. There is a contradiction at the heart of the modern world that we rarely confront directly, and that the orbital black box exists, in some part, to make legible. We have built a civilization that depends on satellites for almost everything. We use them for navigation, GPS, Galileo, GLONASS, Beidou, 6 billion users. We use them for communications, every encrypted military channel, every financial market settlement, every transoceanic phone call. We use them for military command, the AEHF, the SBIRS, the Syracuse, the Sicrel, the Athena Fidus that Olymp-K shadowed in 2017. We use them for timing, the financial markets that synchronize on satellite atomic clocks, the power grids that balance their loads on those clocks, the cellular networks whose handoffs depend on those clocks. We assumed these orbits were sanctuaries, safe because of distance, safe because of international law, safe because of the mutual interest of all nations to keep space peaceful. Take a moment, before this video ends, to understand exactly what that dependence means in operational terms. Every time you tap a contactless payment card, the transaction is time-stamped by a satellite atomic clock. Every time a commercial airliner descends through the cloud layer toward Heathrow or Frankfurt or Schiphol, it is, at one point or another in that descent, depending on a GPS, Galileo, or GLONASS signal for navigation accuracy. Every time a NATO patrol aircraft flies over the Baltic, it is exchanging encrypted data with command nodes through a chain of geostationary relays, several of which lease commercial bandwidth from operators like Eutelsat, Intelsat, SES, and Telenor, the same operators whose satellites Olymp-K parked next to for 11 years. Every time the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, or the Bank of England settles an interbank transaction, the timing precision is derived, somewhere upstream in the dependency chain, from a satellite. The civilian world has built itself on a thin layer of orbiting machines that operate, every day, in a regime where they cannot be reached, cannot be repaired, cannot be replaced quickly, and, as Olymp-K demonstrated for 11 years, cannot be defended against an adversary that has decided to listen. The people who run Eutelsat and Intelsat and Telenor know this. The people who run the German Space Command, the French Direction Générale de l'Armement, and the Italian Ministry of Defense know this. The people who write the United States National Defense Strategy know this. None of them have a plan for it. No commercial satellite operator on Earth has ever fielded an active defensive countermeasure against a proximity eavesdropping satellite. No European government has, as of this video's upload date, deployed an encrypted command link upgrade across its commercial leased military bandwidth. No international treaty mechanism exists to compel Russia to explain what happened on January 30th, 2026, at 6 minutes and 9.03 seconds past 6 o'clock Coordinated Universal Time. The strategic announcements are loud. The operational reality is unchanged. The cycle, even after the death of Olymp-K, continues. Olymp-K proved they are transparent. For 11 years, a single 3,000-kilogram machine wandered the geostationary belt, parked beside 30 different satellites, and drank their electromagnetic signals without ever being stopped. Its death proved they are polluted. The graveyard above geostationary orbit, the attic where we store our orbital dead, is now confirmed to contain lethal, untracked debris, capable of striking passivated satellites and scattering fresh wreckage across the operational belt below. Its successor proves the doctrine continues. Olymp-K2 is listening now. Olymp-K3 is in procurement. The 841st EW Center in Kaliningrad is jamming. The Tobol system is spoofing. The GLONASS-Beidou merger is consolidating. The final metronome. Close. The 27.9-second tumble of Olymp-K's corpse is not a random number. It is the angular momentum signature of a non-central, high-energy debris strike. The forensic fingerprint of an untracked impactor in a regime no one was watching. It is, in McDowell's analysis, the audible heartbeat of a doctrine. The doctrine began at Baikonur on the evening of the 28th of September, 2014, when a Proton-M heavy lifter pushed a 3,000-kilogram payload into transfer orbit under a cover story that no one believed. It continued through April 2015 at 18.1 degrees west, where a sanctuary that had lasted since the dawn of geosynchronous communications quietly ended. It continued through 2017 over the Mediterranean, where Athena Fidus was shadowed by a big-eared satellite that a French defense minister would describe 1 year later in front of the École de l'Air. It continued through 30 separate hideouts in the geostationary belt over 11 years. It continued through the launch of Olymp-K2 in March 2023, and through the 17-satellite stalking file the Financial Times published in February 2026. It continues right now, somewhere in the operational ring above Europe, where Olymp-K2 is currently positioned near a Eutelsat broadcaster covering Europe, Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, and South America. Watched in real time by Aldoria, Slingshot Aerospace, and the small global community of amateur astronomers who never stopped looking up. The orbital sanctuary did not collapse on the 1st of May 2026, at 13 kilometers above the Indian Ocean, when a Russian inspector approached an American GSSAP. It collapsed on the 4th of April 2015, at 18.1 degrees west longitude, when a Russian satellite wandered into a gap between two Intelsat broadcasters and started listening. Everything that has happened since. The Athena Fidus accusation, the rise of the 841st EW Center, the Cosmos 2553 tumble, the 13-kilometer pass, the 17-satellite file, the Sarmat test, the China-Russia navigation merger, the breakup itself, is the same story told in different chapters at different altitudes, by different operators, in a doctrine designed to map, record, and wait. The ghost shattered. The mission goes on. The room it haunted is still in use. The 27.9-second metronome ticks in a graveyard no one is cleaning up, 300 kilometers above the most valuable real estate in the solar system. And we, civilians of a satellite-dependent civilization, still pretend that we have a ceiling. Every case file we open begins with the same question. What is no longer true that we still believe? The sanctuary is gone. The deterrence is gone. The treaties that we're supposed to hold are silent. And the machines above our heads keep moving. Next on Orbital Black Box, Cosmos 2553. Russia's suspected nuclear anti-satellite testbed. Tumbling, uncontrolled, inside the Van Allen radiation belt. What its slow death is telling us about the next 12 months of orbital warfare. If this investigation gave you something the mainstream coverage missed, subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Every new case file drops the moment the orbital catalog updates. Share this video with someone who still believes space is peaceful. They need to see what just happened in the attic. The room is still in use. The metronome is still ticking. We'll see you in the next briefing.